This is before I was born, but in the Soviet Union, people lived by lies, as Solzhenitsyn would say. They lived by lies, and they were afraid to do anything about it. They sold each other out so that they could survive and not be sent off to the gulags. I fear that we're headed in that direction, and the reason why we're headed in that direction, and this is sort of what Solzhenitsyn said, is that we are becoming rapidly, or we may become a nation of where people just don't have the moral courage required to take on the system. And I'm going to talk to you today about that. I'm going to talk to you briefly about what I think moral courage is and how it kind of manifests. There are two types of courage to fight a war, as far as I'm concerned, and as far as von Clausewitz, the military philosopher, is concerned. There is the sort of courage to charge up the hill with a rifle and take it to the enemy. And that courage is probably easier to understand. And then there's a second type of moral courage, and that's the courage to not do what is always popular and to risk your reputation. And from my experience recruiting, and by the way, it's a very, very difficult thing to hire undercover journalists. These people don't have bylines, unlike every other journalist under the sun. They go into a place pretending to be something they're not in order to expose the truth. And sometimes they get arrested. And no one will ever know they're doing it. And they can't even tell their friends and family they're doing it. People often say, well, James, what are you doing now? And I say, we are doing a lot of things. And we have journalists in these safe houses around the United States. We have journalists here in D.C. And you don't know where they are. They're kind of like germs. They're kind of spreading everywhere. But this sort of courage is lacking, and people used to do this. Mike Wallace used to do it. The Chicago Sun-Times used to do it. You read in history books about Upton Sinclair. He used to do it, but nobody does it anymore. And there are reasons for that. I think journalism has ceased to be investigative. It's become all narrative and hyperbole, and it's unbearable. You can't even watch cable news. The chyrons are outrageous on CNN, especially the last week. And the journalism stopped being journalism because of three factors: greed, laziness, and fear. Now let's talk about fear. My friend Jack Cashel told me there are three types of fear: fear for your life, fear for your freedom, and fear for your reputation. It's this last type of fear that is the thing that is deterring people, the fear of the humiliating power of the press, as Dinesh D'Souza would call it, the humiliating power of the press. Everyone in this room knows what I'm talking about. There are people oftentimes in this city who are utterly afraid to stand up for their own principles because they know what CNN is going to say about them if they do. And it's that fear that deters people from doing the right thing. Another example, my friend Bill Whittle told me about this story, this Mark Twain story, in which a general during the Spanish-American War asked his troops to raise their hands if they were willing to lose their lives for their country. And of course, everyone raised their hands, willing to lose our lives. And then the general asked them if they would be willing to be perceived as traitors for the well-being of their country. Nobody raised their hands. They were more afraid of the perception of their reputations than the actual well-being of their country. And I've seen this many times in my own life, and I want to talk to you about that. Now, say what you might say, and I get asked about this guy, Ed Snowden, all the time. I'm sure people in this room are mixed about him, maybe even not mixed. But he ruined his reputation. Now he's exiled in Russia. That might be even worse than being in jail. And he, from what I understand, did sacrifice something. Moral courage is what my mentor, Andrew Breitbart, would call running towards the fire. It's choosing a life of being hated. And my other friend, Rush Limbaugh, has told me and told his audience that being hated is necessary to be effective. And we all want to be loved, right? I didn't get into this to be hated, but oftentimes you have to be hated. So moral courage can help us achieve something beyond ourselves, but often at the core of this is the question of whether we're willing to endure the road of suffering and uncertainty. I only worked for one organization, not called Project Veritas, and that was the Leadership Institute. And Morton Blackwell would often say, you know you can trust someone when they stick by a cause which is losing. And we've had some ups and downs, Project Veritas. We actually operate this organization at great personal risk, but we actually believe in it so strongly that we don't really care what happens to us. We're willing to risk everything, and sometimes that can be a lonely road. And I just want to talk to you for a minute about that, about the challenges. And this is a very personal story. It's personal because, I mean, we have 42 people at Project Veritas, and you don't know who these people are, but I want to talk about the sort of things that we have to go through because it is a very personal thing. The government is constantly trying to shut us down, bankrupt us. I have personally been to jail. I've been incarcerated. I've been put on probation. I've been detained at the border. But we have New York Attorney General. There was a guy named Schneiderman there, heard of him, who was auditing us and demanding the names of our journalists, undercover journalists, so that they can just compromise them. Just because they could, just because they have the power to do so. 21 felonies in California against David Daleiden. They raided his home with AR-15s, a SWAT team. Raided his home when he was taking out his trash because he had the audacity to investigate Planned Parenthood with hidden cameras. Do you know what it feels like to have your house raided by the Attorney General's office with rifles simply because you've investigated an organization that Attorney General happens to like? Listen, it's scary. It's hard. When I went to federal jail on arraignment for a crime I did not commit because the federal judge destroyed the evidence, I stared through plexiglass as the public defender said, "You are being charged with a 10-year felony." I didn't do it, and I was scared. I mean, I was really scared. I thought my life was over. And it's knowing that you are going to possibly face this sort of reprisal and continuing on. It is really not easy. But we fight these lawsuits. I mean, another example which I write about in American Pravda is being detained at the border. We exposed how easy it was to evade border security by crossing the border dressed like Osama bin Laden. Remember that one? Now, I'm an American citizen. I had an American passport with me. It is lawful for me to enter my own country. I just have to file a form. And I was detained at the border some dozen times at JFK and airports. The TSA agents would ask me questions. I'm not TSA, CPB, Customs and Border Patrol, under the Department of Homeland Security. Ask us questions like, who are you voting for? What do you think about Donald Trump? I mean, these are outrageous, unconstitutional, unlawful things. And they would ask them without shame. One of the guys actually said, at one of these checkpoints, he said, "Do you think what you do is funny?" I mean, I don't even know how to respond to that. I mean, no, I don't think it's fun. It's soulless. It's unlawful. It's unconstitutional. It's un-American, and they did it. And I couldn't record it because laws on the book say you can't record Department of Homeland Security agents. Now, I can audio record them. And I did in Seattle. I did. I had one of these little devices. I put it in my pocket. It looked like a USB drive, and they thought it was a USB drive, but it was recording everything they said. And when they asked me these questions about why did you embarrass the government, why are you doing your journalism, I posted it on YouTube. And one of these old shoe leather journalists at the Washington Post, who I guess that guy left and no one exists there anymore like this, but he actually called Customs and Border Patrol and said, "Why are you doing this to Project Veritas?" And would you know that after he made that phone call, the Washington Post did, to Department of Homeland Security about my being detained at the border every time I flew, they stopped detaining me. What does that tell you? It tells you that this age-old saw in journalism that holding people accountable and asking them questions and, shining the sunlight, that actually is good for democracy. The citizens need to be informed. They have to consent to what the government is doing. But that guy left the Washington Post, by the way, and you could hear a pin drop when I was incarcerated and on probation. The government wouldn't let me do journalism. For 3 years, I was on federal probation for walking into a federal building with a camera. 3 years. Journalists walk into federal buildings all the time with cameras and notebooks, but I started sending these cameras around to other people, and I couldn't leave my parents' house So I would mail them to other people, and volunteers would go in and they'd start filming on their own. And the government couldn't stop us. We fight these lawsuits, by the way, like heavyweight boxers. We fight back. Our defense attorneys are offensive. They, like General Motors did in the 1980s, they fight back, and we don't settle anymore. We used to settle, never again. I'm never settling a lawsuit ever again. I'm never pleading guilty to a misdemeanor ever again. So help me God, we will fight back. We've had several attempts to infiltrate us at Project Veritas, and by the way, turnabout is fair play, so I don't blame them, but they don't film us when they try to infiltrate. They just make up accusations. We've had betrayal and even friendly fire from allies wanting their names in the paper. If you want your name in the paper, the best thing you can do is condemn one of your friends. Because the left knows how to circle the wagons, and the right, for sure, knows how to circle the firing squad. Our building has been vandalized when we release these major stories. And worst of all, we do receive death threats. And most recently in New York, I was escorted out at an event and by a mob of Antifa people who were waiting for me with black masks, batons, and weapons. Thankfully, there was an NYPD guy there, but moments later, they smashed the guy's skull into a curb. Literally right next to me, as I was thrown into the back of a car. So there are all these, I guess you could call them handicaps, risks, violence. I would say I fear the government more than I fear violence, or we do. And it's not just me, we have this whole army of people. And these are the sort of burdens. I would not be surprised if one day one of these deep state agencies stormed our office with some outrageous, fallacious document. I mean, people say, did Lois Lerner stamped our tax exemption? How the heck did you get a tax exemption from Lois Lerner? I have it framed in my office. Because we're called Veritas, she probably thought we were a Latin book club and not undercover journalists. But we are a tax-exempt charity organization with a mission statement to educate and expose. Now, I just want to talk a little bit about my upbringing, and then I want to talk to you about what you can do about these problems in our country, because there is something you can do about it. There is a way you can help us, not just giving us funding and sharing our videos. I was raised by my grandfather, who taught me a lot. He unfortunately had a stroke in 2011. But he taught me the art of doing the impossible. When I was a little kid, my father bought a home. And unfortunately, we worked on this home every day. I was doing roofing work, plumbing work, painting work. Now, the home burned down. The home, not totally, but there was a house fire. And we picked ourselves up, and literally the next day we walked back to that house. I still remember the smoldering ashes and the smell, the stench of burnt plastic and papers and mattresses, and we literally just started building the home back up. We didn't have a lot of money. My family was, lower middle class, and my grandfather would actually go down to the local dumpster where the contractor would discard all the wood. And I would climb into the dumpster to take the scrap wood from what the contractors were throwing out, and I would use the wood to build a garage with my grandfather. It was an extraordinary lesson. And when the house fire happened, we had to dig a stairway down to the furnace room so that there was protection in it and against a next fire. And I remember digging this ditch, sweat pouring down my face, cutting up my hands, and my grandfather said to me, he said, Irish, he said, sometimes you're going to have to dig a ditch, but there's honor in digging a ditch. And you never give up. You never give up. Now, he didn't understand when I actually broke the acorn story with the pimps and the hookers. He couldn't quite understand what was going on years later, but it taught me that you never give up. You trust your instincts, and you never give up. And I had that unique upbringing with a person who taught me the art of perseverance and dedication, no matter what you do, even if it's undercover journalism or digging a ditch. Now, unfortunately, these days, moral courage is difficult because people, in my opinion, value conformity over disruption. People who are disruptive, like the journalists at Project Veritas, it's treated as an act of subversion by the government. The Soviet-era mantra, "Find me the man and I'll show you the crime," rings true. They can just arbitrarily and capriciously level illegalities against people they don't like. There's no equal justice under the law. And that brings me to the topic of Veritas leaks. We no longer have just undercover journalists infiltrating, exposing, uncovering things. Now we have people on the inside of these organizations, like Twitter, who came forward to us. I met with this guy, and he says, if anybody knew I was meeting with you, I'd lose my job, I'd lose my mortgage, I'd lose everything. But I'm willing to do it because something needs to be done here in Silicon Valley. We have these people who are stepping forward, not just covertly, who are actually unwitting whistleblowers, giving us information, showing us where the bodies are buried. That's the future. That's what the citizens of this country need to do. They need to actually not be afraid to come forward. So we have this program set up called Veritas Tips at protonmail.com, and we have people inside these agencies who are coming forward to us, who are saying, this is outrageous, I cannot live by lies. But it's going to require sacrifice. They are going to get attacked sometimes. We're going to get attacked. That's just what it takes. And there are many things out there that need to be exposed. I can't tell you. Everywhere I go, people say, well, you got to expose this thing and that thing and this thing. It's almost like people crave investigative journalism. The people need to be informed of this country. Our country exists with the consent of the governed. But that consent cannot be manufactured by outlets like CNN. It has to be an informed consent. The people need to be informed. So I encourage you to think, what are you willing to die for? What are you willing to live for? What are you willing to give up? If I told you that you could change the world and make society more ethical and transparent, but it required you to make a personal sacrifice, or your family member to make a personal sacrifice, to step forward into the sunlight, would you do it if you knew that you could be effective? Would you make the sacrifice? What could I do to convince you to make the sacrifice? Maybe you'd like to come meet our undercover journalists in New York State in our bunker who are making those sort of sacrifices without a byline. I wish you could see the whistleblowers who stepped forward. I just ask you, what could be holding you back? Is it the fear? Is it the retaliation? The dreaded CNN chyrons? The people in cable news who will call you names? Is that really holding you back? Because it shouldn't. Because we have one thing on our side that they don't. We have reality on our side. We have truth on our side. Amen. But words, video transfixes in a way that words don't. So we need visual confirmation of the corruption. We need visual confirmation of the page text messages. We need to hear it, we need to see it, we need to smell it, we need to experience the greed, the lack of introspection, the avarice that is the deep state. And you can do something about it. I am here to ask one thing of you in Washington, D.C. If you know anyone who is on the inside, who sees something that shocks their conscience, who can't live with what they're seeing, please have them contact us. I will go to jail to protect them, and I actually have been to jail to protect them, so I have the scars to prove what I'm saying. These tips are anonymous, and we will follow up. So I ask you not to be afraid. Don't be afraid. Stand up for something. Figure out what you're willing to do, and stay tuned, because if you're lying, cheating, stealing, or scamming, you will become the next unwilling internet celebrity, thanks to Project Veritas.